Hello, this is Malachi Bishop. This is RC-750, Rehabilitation Counseling Research and Program Evaluation. And in this section, we are talking about data collection and survey research, how to do it and how not do it right. I did that on purpose. And we will be focusing on survey research in the section on data collection. But there are 6 major methods of data collection for both research and program evaluation. And so with this section, we are slowly starting to move into the topic of program evaluation. But what we talk about in this section will apply to both. And actually, as we'll talk about in the next couple sections from now, there's really little distinction between research and program evaluation. Really, the distinction we will make is that program evaluation is an application of this sort of research methods that we've been talking about all along. So in research and program evaluation, there are 6 major methods of data collection. Many of these we've been talking about throughout the semester, so this will be review and a brief review for some of these. And then, as I said, we will be spending more time talking about questionnaires in particular and survey-based research. So the 6 major methods of data collection include tests, questionnaires, interviews, focus groups, observation, and existing or secondary data. So as a researcher, considering which method is going to be most appropriate to address my research or program evaluation questions, some considerations, because frequently you will have the option of using any or any combination of data collection methods. So the issue is which is going to be the most effective in terms of answering your questions. So some things to consider include, will the nature of the audience conform to the methods? And by audience, I mean research participants or members of the agency or program that you are evaluating. And by conform to the methods, I mean which method of collecting data is going to be most likely to allow you to collect the most data from the largest number of participants and the kind of data that you need. So for example, will the people who you are asking to fill out your questionnaire, will they fill out your questionnaire? Will they do it carefully? And will the people engage in interviews or focus groups if you decide to go that way? Will you have access to examining documents? So on. So will the nature of the data collection method conform to and work with the people that you're trying to collect data from? Second is, can anyone administer the method, or is training required? And if training is required, is it available? So the issue there is there are some data collection methods, like interviewing, for example, where you may need training before you can perform the data collection. Also, some tests require that you complete training before you can administer the tests. So that's an important question and consideration there too. How can the information be analyzed, and what form of information is going to be most appropriate for the sorts of analysis that you want to do? And then, will the approach answer the questions that you're asking? So for example, a qualitative approach, ideal for some questions, but doesn't provide you the sort of numeric data that you may need. So is the approach that you take going to get your questions answered? So to review the 6 methods, the first is tests, and we've talked about the issues associated with testing previously in this semester, but questions include, should you use a standardized test? that has the benefit of usually including information on reliability, validity, norm samples, and so on, test construction in the manual for a standardized test. The alternative is to develop your own test. And we talked about the fact that sometimes there is not a test in existence that answers your question or answers it in the way that you want to have it answered. So the alternative is to develop your own test, and issues there are that you do not have the information about reliability, validity, and psychometrics in general. Second form of data collection is interviews. And in an interview, the interviewer asks the interviewee questions, either in person or over the telephone. The issues in interviewing, trust and rapport, are important. So the interviewer's capacity to establish rapport and develop trust, comfort in the interviewee, and also a willingness to answer the questions. And the willingness is increased when trust and rapport are developed. So we're talking about the skills of the interviewer, whether that is you as the researcher or people who are working on the research project. So that's an important consideration. Probing is available. In other words, following up and asking follow-up questions to achieve clarity or gain additional information, and that's less of an option, and sometimes not an option if you're talking about questionnaires. Some examples of standard probes would include things like, is there anything else you'd like to tell me about that? Any other reasons for the answer that you gave? Or what do you mean? Things like that. So you can ask probing follow-up questions. Interviews may be quantitative or qualitative in nature. Focus groups, and we talked about focus groups, so we will review some of the key points. Focus group is a situation where a focus group moderator keeps a small and homogeneous group of 6 to 12 people generally focused on the discussion of a research topic or issue. Focus group sessions generally last between 1 and 3 hours. About an hour and a half is fairly typical, and they are recorded using audio or videotapes. And focus groups are useful for exploring ideas and obtaining in-depth information about how people think about an issue. There are pros and cons, strengths and weaknesses associated with focus groups. The strengths are that they are useful for exploring ideas and concepts about an issue. They have the capacity to provide a perspective on participants' internal thinking that you don't necessarily achieve with other data collection methods. Provides a good deal of rich and in-depth information for analysis. It allows participants to interact, which allows generating dialogue and ideas that may not have occurred to you. So it's a very fruitful method of interaction and generating information. It allows for follow-up, as interviewing does, so does focus group data collection. It allows you to follow up and make sure as a researcher or program evaluator that you have clarity about the person's point that they're making. It is video, audio, or audio taped, and so you have a record that you can refer back to. And it allows quick turnaround, so rather than waiting for responses to come back in the mail, for example, you have the data right away and you can begin your analysis right away. Some of the weaknesses of focus groups: they can be expensive depending on how you do it, but things like paying for a room or renting a room, equipment, and if you give your participants food and drink, which I generally recommend, but you have to be careful about getting the right food and drink for your participants. But those sorts of things may add up, and so focus groups can be expensive. They are reactive and investigator effects may occur if participants feel that they are being watched or studied. So people sometimes freeze up and respond differently when they are being recorded, watched, or studied. So that can sometimes be an issue. Focus groups may be dominated by one or two participants, and so the importance of moderator skills was discussed, and the ability to draw out and sometimes stop people from giving too much information so that other people can participate is a skill sometimes needed. It can be difficult to generalize the results if small unrepresentative samples of participants are used. So sometimes you get good information, but your sample is so unrepresentative that the results don't generalize to a larger population. You may receive large amounts of extra or unnecessary information. Usually, focus groups should not be the only data collection methods used in a study, but certainly they are one valuable contribution to the data that you can receive. And then data analysis can be time consuming. Because of the richness of the data that I was talking about, transcribing the recordings and then going through all that data certainly can be time consuming. So pros and cons to focus groups. Number 4, observation. And here's, in this method, the researcher observes participants in natural or structured environments. It is important to collect observational data in addition to attitudinal data, because what people say is not always what they do. So depending on the research question, obviously, observation isn't always going to be the most appropriate method of data collection, but it can be very important to collect observational data because, as I suggested, what people say is not always the way that they act. Observation can be carried out in 2 types of environments: laboratory settings and naturalistic settings. And then number 5, the use of secondary or existing data. And we'll make a distinction between secondary data, which is data originally used for a different purpose. So it was collected for a different purpose by a researcher or for some other purpose, and that would be contrasted with primary data, which was original data collected for a new research study or data not collected for any research study, but just existing and useful for the purpose of our research. The most commonly used secondary data, so data collected for another research study, are documents, physical data, and archived research data. And there are 2 main kinds of documents: personal documents, which would include things like letters, diaries, and family pictures and things like that, so things belonging to an individual and collected, written, or recorded for private purposes. And then official documents, which are things written or recorded for public or private organizations, and that would include things like newspapers, annual reports, yearbooks, and minutes of meetings. In terms of physical data, we're talking about any material thing created or left by humans that might provide information about a phenomenon of interest to a researcher. So this could include various physical data that may originate from and then archived research data, and this is research data collected by other researchers for other purposes that are saved so that others might later use the data. So this is data collected by a researcher for another purpose, and then you, as a researcher, may gain access to the data and find that it's very useful for answering a different question, so a different research purpose. And then number 6, questionnaires. And a questionnaire is a self-report data collection instrument that is filled out by a research participant. And questionnaires are usually paper and pencil instruments, or increasingly, as you're probably aware, survey research is being conducted on the internet. And a lot of useful internet survey options are becoming available. Internet and also other electronic forms, which would include, for example, email-based survey research. Quick distinction to make between the terms survey and questionnaire. Generally, when we talk about survey, we are talking about the kind of research that is done. So survey-based research is research in which researchers use questionnaires to collect information. And technically, the questionnaire is the instrument that you use to collect the data when you're doing survey-based research. So technically, the paper or instrument on the internet where people actually fill in their information, that people actually write on, a lot of times we call those surveys, but technically that should be called the questionnaire, and the questionnaire is what we use in doing survey research. So survey is the research, questionnaire is the instrument. Alright, so we're going to talk about some issues in survey-based research and developing questionnaires. So one issue I wanted to point out is in research and program evaluation, you have a number of different survey research designs that may be available to you. Probably the most frequently used, certainly in rehabilitation counseling research, is the cross-sectional design, where you take a cross-section of the population. So a one-time study, one-time data collection, where you take a cross-section, so you select a sample of the population for a one-time study. Sometimes we're interested in changes over time, though. So a couple of additional options are longitudinal studies, where we would sample from a population and then track that sample over time, and then successive independent samples. And this would be, let's say we were interested in people participating in a program like vocational rehabilitation, and we wanted to track over time how people felt about the evaluation component of the vocational rehabilitation counseling process. So one way you might do that would be to take successive independent samples. So rather than tracking people longitudinally, and rather than doing a one-time cross-section of people in evaluation, you would take a sample of people in evaluation at one point in time, and then in the future take another sample of people, and then in the future take another sample of people in evaluation. Or you could take, for example, if you wanted to track people throughout the whole rehabilitation counseling process, then you, rather than following people through the process, so doing a longitudinal study, which has, sometimes that's the most appropriate approach, and certainly it's very useful and important approach to survey research design. Sometimes that's the best way to do it. But there are problems with longitudinal studies. High rates of dropping out, the expense of tracking people over time. So sometimes the successive independent samples approach is just more economical and allows you to work with larger groups of people. So again, tracking people over time in terms of the rehabilitation counseling process You might, for example, sample people at intake and then sample people during the evaluation process, maybe take a sample of people later along in the process who are doing some receiving some other sorts of services, maybe people who are receiving job placement, people who have just recently successfully completed the rehabilitation plan, and then people at follow-up. So you could get a sense of people's experiences in each of the components of the rehabilitation plan. But rather than doing it by following a person through the rehabilitation counseling process, you could use successive independent samples. Alright, a few points to think about in terms of developing a survey, developing survey-based research. The first thing to consider is defining your objectives. So when you are designing a questionnaire, the important thing to keep in mind is the purpose of your research. What is the question that you are trying to answer? And I say this because it's critical that you remember that shorter questionnaires will give you a higher response rate. People are more likely to respond to a shorter questionnaire than a longer questionnaire. And you've probably experienced that yourself. You probably know that you are more likely to complete a short questionnaire rather than a long one. So in designing a questionnaire, you have to think about, how can I make sure I get all the information I need, but not have anything excessive? I want to keep this as short as possible. So have everything you need, but also make sure that you need everything that you have in there. So what I'm suggesting is focus on the question. And as you're writing items for your survey questionnaire, basically make sure that every question that you're writing is necessary, is needed. And begin with and refer back to the research question. After you have generated your survey questionnaire, make sure that every question is related to the research question. Okay, so focus on the question and focus on only having the information, the questions that you need. Second, estimate the resources necessary for the project. So you have a research project, you have a program evaluation, and you have different methods of data collection. If you've elected to do a survey, then things to consider include time. And time is an issue in the kind of survey that you do. Internet-based or email-based surveys tend to get you data back faster, for example, than mail-based surveys. But the components of the survey, developing the survey, delivering the survey, receiving the completed survey questionnaires back, and then entering the data, analyzing the data, it's a multi-step process. So you need to consider, is it most effective for the amount of time that you have? Money is an issue in survey research. It will be an issue in determining the type of survey that you do and the number of surveys that you can ask people to complete. Again, things like mailing, things like getting people to help you with large surveys, all those sorts of things, buying paper and envelopes, or entering data, all those sorts of things may be associated with money, depending on where you're doing the research. So how much money is it going to cost, and what are the options there? Personnel. Do you need people to help you stuff those envelopes, to help you enter the data, things like that? So depending on the size of the research, are extra personnel going to be required? Cooperation of your participants, talked about that, and then human subjects. Human subjects takes time. If you're going to be, for example, at a university, and you're going to be submitting a project for human subjects approval, you have to enter that into the equation and think about the time that's going to be spent in seeking human subjects approval, in submitting and then waiting for the Human Subjects Committee to meet and evaluate your proposal. Sometimes they ask you to make some changes and then resubmit it. So that whole process needs to be considered when you're thinking about the resources. It's particularly important when you're thinking about the time that you have, because you have to build in some time for that human subjects component. Number 3, issues to consider. What's your target population? Target the population for which the survey is intended. How are you going to get the right people to answer your questions? What's critical to consider here is accurately identifying the population from which the sample is to be drawn. If you get too broad of a sample, then you will include people for whom the research is not relevant, and that will reduce your response rate. Or you'll get information from people who aren't really familiar with the issue or question or experience about which you are trying to gain information. And if your sample is too specific, too small, or otherwise too specific, you may end up excluding people and information who it would be important to hear from. So think about who is your target population. Who are the people that you really need to get this information from, and then how am I going to identify and target them and get them to complete my questionnaires. So number 4, decide on the most appropriate sampling method. And we've talked about a variety of sampling approaches: random sampling, stratified, convenience sampling, and so on. Which approach is going to be most effective and appropriate for you in this research study or program evaluation? And how are you going to identify the population and the people in your sample? How are you going to contact people? Number 5, communicating the nature of the study and the directions to the respondents. So you've identified your sample, you've contacted them in the appropriate method. The issue here is providing them with the information that they need. So what are they going to be asked to do? Why are you doing this research? Why are they being asked to answer these questions? Who's going to ask the questions? And how will the information be disseminated and used? You have to think about providing all that informed consent information and contact information for you as the researcher, and then providing clear and concise directions, particularly important when we're talking about survey research. So your survey instrument, your questionnaire, has to be very clear in terms of what you're asking and how you want the respondents to participate. We're going to talk more about writing clear and concise questions, but the directions also have to be very clear and concise. So things like, when do you need this back? How do I return it to you? How should I return this questionnaire when I'm finished with it? All of those sorts of questions, you need to provide clear information about that. And then implementing procedures for maximizing your response rate. You want a high response rate. You want to get back as many questionnaires as you can. So there are a few things that we're going to talk about that you can and should do in order to enhance or increase your response rate. We're going to talk about the design of the questionnaire, the delivery of the questionnaire, the issue of inducements, pre-survey and post-survey follow-up, and things like that, more specifically one at a time. First issue is pre-notification letters. And these are letters that you send to potential participants, letting them know that they will be receiving a survey from you in the mail or by email or however you're sending it, but it lets them know that it will be coming in the next few days. Pre-notification letters may help to establish the legitimacy of a survey. let them know who you are and that the questionnaire is part of an important research project, and it will potentially contribute to the respondent's trust and therefore their likelihood that they will complete your questionnaire. They do increase the response rate, and one of the reasons for that may be that the pre-notification letter builds expectation and reduces the possibility that a potential respondent will disregard the survey when it arrives. So pre-notification letter, in other words, may make it less likely that they will just delete or toss your survey when it comes. It lets them know, it helps them build expectation, think about the fact that it's coming, and keep an eye out for it and recognize it when it comes. And as I said, pre-notification letters do appear to increase response rate. In one meta-analysis of studies where they explored whether this is true, about a 7.7% increase was observed over studies when a pre-notification letter was used. That's a pretty significant increase in response rate. Somewhere between 10 and 60% of those sent questionnaires will respond without follow-up reminders. So that's a big range. In the social sciences and rehabilitation counseling, we'll frequently see numbers like 20, which is quite low, up to 50-60%. The point is, if your response rate is too low, then you are faced with the situation where you don't know if your sample is really representative of the population. So you want to get that response rate as high as you can, and anything you can do to increase the response rate, you should do. So pre-notification letters increase your response rate about 8%, then you have to think about using that. But one of the most powerful tools for increasing response rate is to use reminders. And this can be this is basically usually a follow-up letter or follow-up contact, and you can increase the response from follow-up attempts by including another copy of the questionnaire if you are using a mail survey. So if you're doing a mail-based survey, it's helpful to send a reminder that says something like about 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, whatever it is, you received a survey. We're writing to say thank you for completing it if you already completed it and returned it. If you did not, this research is very important, and we would appreciate you returning the survey to us. But if you also include the questionnaire in your follow-up letter, then that's going to increase the response rate, because frequently, what have they done with it? They've thrown it away. So in that case, a follow-up isn't going to be very helpful unless you are providing another copy of the questionnaire. So keep that in mind. All right, should you do a mail survey or an internet-based survey? Let's talk about the benefits and drawbacks of each option. Mail-based surveys may be the best option when your sample consists of respondents with higher educational and literacy levels, and they are people with a high interest in the subject of your research. Mailing lists may also be available to assist you in reaching your target population. So frequently there will be some sort of list. For example, agencies, advocacy groups sometimes have mailing lists that they use to keep in touch with their members. And sometimes as a researcher or program evaluator, you will be able to access those mailing lists and be very helpful in reaching your target population. Web surveys will go to internet users, and mail surveys have the benefit, therefore, of being distributed to a more general population. The drawbacks of mail-based survey include primarily the expense of mailing, which include things like paper, envelopes, stamps, and then folding and stuffing. If you have a large sample that you're sending the surveys to, and that costs money. And then also it takes longer to get the information back. And it also takes longer to transfer the data into a form, like putting it into an Excel or an SPSS format that will allow you to do data analysis. So mail-based surveys can take longer and can be more expensive. So there are benefits and drawbacks to mail-based surveys. The advantages of web-based surveys then, again, the flip side of those drawbacks of mail-based surveys, the advantages of using web-based surveys include faster delivery, faster responses, and ease of transferring data, because frequently the existing internet survey options that you have will actually return the data to you in the form of, for example, an Excel sheet. So it's already entered, or it's easier to enter just transferring electronic data than transferring data from paper into the electronic form, and it's cheaper. Web and email surveys are useful if you want to target a specific population, such as if all the members of an organization, like all the vocational rehabilitation counselors in your state, you want to reach them, then frequently there will be things like listservs or other sorts of lists that you can use to target and only reach the people that you are trying to reach. Disadvantages of web surveys include that they typically do not reflect the general population because of access issues that we'll talk about. If your survey is posted on the web, another issue is that, let's say you've been given permission to post it on a website where you think people who are interested in the topic of your research are likely to go. It's a good way sometimes of reaching people and collecting data, but without password protection or other means of controlling access, it's a very open way of collecting data and accessing potential participants. And so you may attract respondents who are outside of your target population. A potential disadvantage is that it's easy to delete a web-based or internet or email survey. Maybe easier and causing less pause, for example, than throwing away a piece of mail. And then the access issues, which are really the key issues in terms of disadvantages in rehabilitation counseling research, because you will have more limited access in general to people with disabilities if you use an internet-based survey. And that's just based on statistics. According to the Pew Internet and American Life survey, and I provided the website for that site, and that where you can access research about internet research in America. It's a very interesting website, and I recommend it. But if you go there, you'll find that Americans living with a disability are less likely than other adults to use the internet. Statistically, about 54% of adults living with a disability use the internet, compared with about 81% of adults who do not have or do not report a disability. Also, having a disability is statistically associated with being older, less educated, and living in a lower income household. Internet use is statistically associated with being younger, college educated, and living in a higher income household. So when all these demographic factors, when all of these demographic factors are controlled for, living with a disability is still negatively correlated with someone's likelihood to have internet access. So statistically, you're more likely to be to have internet access in America if you are not a person with a disability. And so as a researcher, you have to keep that in mind. Other demographics that come into play in terms of access. 1 in 5 American adults does not use the internet. And senior citizens or elderly people, adults with less than a high school education, and those living in households earning less than $30,000 per year are among the least likely adults to have internet access. So in terms of accessing the populations that you want to access when you're doing your research, you have to consider those demographic factors, particularly important, as I said, in rehabilitation counseling research. Other issues are accessing people in rural areas. You're statistically less likely to access rural areas, people in rural areas, if you are doing internet research. And then also you have to consider language-based barriers and ethnicity and geographic background and language-based barriers to accessing your questionnaire and completing it. All right, let's talk about incentives, which are basically things that you give people so that they will complete your questionnaire. Non-monetary incentives is one option, and then monetary or money incentives is another. Non-monetary incentives include things like token gifts, like small packages of coffee, tea bags. I've received surveys with a tea bag inside, ballpoint pens, a postage stamp, a key ring, things like that, or a donation in your name to a charity. Those sorts of non-monetary inducements have generally resulted in an increased response, the research suggests, but not consistently, but generally you'll have an increased response. But the fact is you'll have a higher response if you use money. Money also costs more, but the average increase in response rate for money-based incentives was about 19%, and for non-monetary incentives about 8%. So that's important to keep in mind. If you can afford money works better, but non-monetary incentives also are effective. The promise of an incentive for a return questionnaire appears to be less effective in increasing responses than an incentive that you include. So saying, if you complete this questionnaire, then you will receive an incentive, that seems to be somewhat less effective than actually including the incentive. And higher monetary incentives generally work better than smaller ones. It makes sense. More money works better than less money. And a meta-analysis of 15 studies showed that an incentive of 25 cents increased the response rate by an average of 16%. Increase of $1 increased the response by 31%. So more money works better than less money. Should you use stamps or business reply? This is an interesting bit of research too. Researchers have looked at, are people more likely to return an envelope, a questionnaire, in an envelope that has a stamp on it, a return envelope with a stamp on it, or a return business reply envelope. And mail surveys that include a self-addressed stamped reply envelope appeared to get better responses than business reply envelopes. Some of the reasons that might be, people might feel obligated to complete the questionnaire because of the guilt associated with throwing away money in the form of a postage stamp. Other researchers have suggested that using a business reply permit might suggest advertising to some people, so they'd be more likely to throw it away, and business reply envelopes might be perceived as less personal. So if you have the time and the money, a stamp might be worth your while. A meta-analysis of 34 studies comparing stamp versus business reply postage showed that stamp reply envelopes had a 9% greater aggregate effect than business reply envelopes. In another meta-analysis on 9 studies, an aggregate effect of 6.2%. So there does seem to be something there with the stamps compared to the business reply. On the other hand, stamps cost more. So in the long run, because business reply is cheaper, it may be a wash, but something to think about. And that concludes the first part of this discussion of data collection and survey research. In the next section, we will talk about the specifics of developing a survey questionnaire.